It was never meant to end like this. Not in a cold room within the ancient stone walls of Balmoral Castle, where generations of monarchs had sought refuge from the roar of the world outside. Not under the watchful eyes of portraits long gone, as history looked on in silence. Yet here stood Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex by title, but in every other way, an outsider, facing the man who had once walked her down the aisle as a symbol of acceptance, unity, and perhaps even love. King Charles III. But this time, there was no celebration, no cameras, no gowns or veils. Only finality. She had arrived unaccompanied. No Harry by her side. No aides, no cameras, no press trail. For once, the Duchess had come quietly. But even that silence had made noise across the world. The palace gates, usually flanked by nothing more than tourists and guards, had drawn a different kind of crowd that morning. Royal watchers, curious journalists, even disillusioned former fans who had once hailed Meghan as the fresh breath the monarchy so desperately needed. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Why now? That was the question burning through social media threads and whispered among insiders. After years of tell-all interviews, best-selling memoirs, Netflix documentaries, and accusations that left Buckingham Palace in damage control mode, what could possibly prompt Meghan to request a private audience with the king? And more pressingly, why would he grant it? The answer wasn't simple. For months, behind gilded doors and closed lips, tensions within the royal family had boiled quietly. The Sussexes' once sympathetic narrative was beginning to crack. Public opinion, especially in the UK, had shifted. Polls showed a rising number of citizens believed the monarchy was better off without them. And for the first time, even American media, once charmed by Meghan's Hollywood roots and humanitarian flair, began asking uncomfortable questions. What had been real? What had been staged? And had reconciliation ever truly been on the table? King Charles, burdened with his late mother's legacy and the pressing need to modernize the monarchy, had wrestled privately with these dilemmas. His reign had not begun in peace. Scandals lingered like smoke. His son, Prince Harry, had gone from beloved spare to estranged rebel. And Meghan had become a symbol of division. A lightning rod, loved and loathed in equal measure. Every move she made, every word she uttered, was dissected with almost religious fervor. The royal family, so often stoic and silent, had never experienced this level of personal attack from within. Yet here she was. The request had come in the form of a letter, handwritten, insiders said, and devoid of the usual legal phrasing or media-conscious wording. Some described it as heartfelt, others as strategic, and a few who saw it claimed it contained something rare from Meghan: humility. She had asked not for restoration of title or role, not for power or publicity, but for a chance to speak. Privately, with Charles, one-on-one. It was an ask loaded with consequences. The king, advisors said, had wrestled with the decision. Many within the firm were firmly against it. Camilla, queen consort, reportedly called it a waste of time, while Princess Anne refused to comment entirely, her silence louder than any denial. Even Prince William, the future king, was said to have voiced his concerns in unusually blunt terms. She's had her chances, he allegedly told a senior aide. She used them to burn bridges, not build them. But King Charles, ever the conflicted father, had made his choice. What happened behind those Balmoral doors would come to define a new chapter in royal history. Not because it was diplomatic or constructive, but because it was final. Sources closest to the meeting, while sworn to confidentiality, couldn't contain their astonishment. The meeting had not lasted hours. It had been swift, focused, and brutally honest. Words were exchanged that hadn't been spoken since the final days of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Names were invoked. Promises, long since broken, were dragged back into the light. Meghan, once hailed as a potential princess of the people, now stood alone, stripped of spin, facing a monarch she may have underestimated for far too long. And it wasn't just the private setting or the emotional gravity that made this encounter so pivotal, it was what followed. The palace, in a highly unusual move, made no official statement after Meghan's departure. But the very absence of a denial spoke volumes. Within hours, whispers began leaking from courtiers, aides, and longtime royal correspondents. Something had gone terribly wrong inside that room. Meghan, who had entered with poise and determination, had exited pale-faced, with what one source described as the expression of someone who had miscalculated everything. Public interest exploded. Was this the moment King Charles finally cut the cord? Did he, as some claimed, tell Meghan she would never again be permitted to represent the royal family in any capacity? That the door, once slightly ajar, was now shut forever? And what of Prince Harry? He was not present, a detail that raised even more eyebrows. For a couple who had presented themselves as a united front in their retreat from royal life, his absence spoke volumes. Had he approved the meeting? Had he warned her not to go? Or, more hauntingly, had Meghan acted alone, desperate to salvage something from the ashes of royal rejection? Behind the palace walls, a quiet shift had already begun. That very evening, Catherine, Princess of Wales, made a surprise appearance at a charity gala. Elegant and composed, she wore a sapphire brooch, the same one Diana had worn during a famous diplomatic trip. Royal watchers called it a statement, a reminder, a reclaiming of narrative. And then came the shock of all shocks. Zara Tindall, the fiercely independent daughter of Princess, and appeared in an official capacity alongside King Charles at a private estate reception, holding court with foreign dignitaries. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Zara, long the informal heartbeat of the younger royals, had always shunned the spotlight. But in Meghan's absence, and with Charles reportedly eyeing a more streamlined, trusted royal circle, Zara's presence suddenly seemed strategic. Was a replacement already being groomed for the title Meghan had once embodied? Was this the quiet ascension of a new duchess, one without scandal, without spectacle? As the dust continued to settle, one thing became clear. Meghan's return to the royal fold, however brief, however sincere, had ignited something irreversible. Not reconciliation, not redemption, but reckoning. This wasn't just about one woman and one king. This was about legacy, identity, and the raw wounds of a monarchy still learning how to survive in the glare of modern scrutiny. For Charles, the meeting was a test of loyalty to his crown, to his late mother's values, and to the future he was building. For Meghan, it may have been a last attempt to rewrite the ending. But fate, as always, had other plans. What exactly was said behind that locked door? What triggered King Charles's alleged fury? And how did the meeting spiral so quickly from a quiet gesture to a permanent exile? Stay with us as we unravel the details, chapter by chapter, uncovering the moments that led to what some now call the final royal goodbye. From handwritten letters and whispered phone calls, to Zara's rising star and Harry's deafening silence. This is the story the palace hoped would never reach the public. But it has. And once the crown speaks, even in silence, the whole world listens. For most people, a letter is a simple thing. A few words scribbled onto paper, sealed, and sent away with hope or urgency. But for Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, a letter to the British monarch wasn't just ink on paper. It was an act of rebellion, repentance, and risk, all wrapped into one. And when that letter arrived at Buckingham Palace in the final days of June, slipped quietly into the royal correspondence pile, it set off an avalanche of whispers inside the institution she had once so famously escaped. No royal aide expected it. The last time Meghan had communicated directly with any senior member of the royal family was during the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Even then, her contact had been brief, carefully worded, and channeled through official representatives. But this letter, handwritten on thick cream stationery, marked only with her California address and signed simply as Meghan, broke every protocol the palace had grown used to enforcing. It was direct, personal, and dangerously sincere. The letter was addressed not to the office of the king, not to his private secretary, but to Charles himself. It bypassed courtiers, lawyers, and PR advisors. That alone made it exceptional, and perhaps alarming. Inside the envelope, the contents were more surprising still. According to insiders familiar with the situation, those who had either seen the letter or heard it read aloud in hushed tones, it did not begin with formality. There was no Your Majesty, no deferential overtures. It began with one word: Charles. From the very first line, Meghan had done what she always did, disrupted the script. The tone was emotional, not strategic. Her words were described as raw, reflective, and filled with what some read as vulnerability and others read as veiled calculation. The letter opened by referencing the distance between them, not just physically, but emotionally and symbolically. Meghan wrote of regret, of missed chances for healing, and even acknowledged that her choices had hurt the family in ways she had not anticipated. But it wasn't just an apology. It was a narrative, a crafted explanation for years of public exposure, emotional interviews, and incendiary claims. She claimed she had acted from a place of pain, that the palace had failed to protect her when the media storm grew unbearable. She referenced the tabloids, the racial attacks, and the emotional toll it had taken on her and Harry. But, most notably, she also admitted that some of her actions may have deepened those wounds rather than soothed them. That line, "I see now that some of my actions hurt more than helped," struck a chord with the royal staff who saw it. For some, it felt like the first time Meghan had come close to acknowledging her role in the royal divide. But others weren't so sure. The wording was precise, the tone careful, and even in its vulnerability, it still kept Meghan at the center of the storm. Then came the real bombshell. Meghan requested a private meeting with King Charles. No Harry, no intermediaries, no press, just the two of them. She asked for a chance to speak as family, not as public figures. She emphasized the need to find peace, not for appearances, but for their children. Archie and Lilibet deserve a future that isn't built on silence and resentment, she wrote. They deserve to know they come from more than just a fractured past. It was this line, invoking the children, that reportedly struck Charles hardest. Despite all the fractures in their relationship, Charles had always maintained a quiet affection for his grandchildren. The thought of Archie and Lilibet growing up without a relationship with their grandfather was said to weigh heavily on him, even in moments of firm resolve. The letter ended simply. No demands, no ultimatums. Just a date range for when she would be in the UK and a humble request for time. Even 30 minutes, she wrote. If that's all you can give me. Palace insiders were thrown into turmoil. The letter wasn't just unprecedented, it was divisive. Senior aides argued fiercely over whether it should even be responded to. Some believed Meghan was staging a calculated PR move before her upcoming business launch in California. Others feared it was part of a larger scheme to gather new content for another documentary or book. There was speculation that perhaps the meeting would be secretly recorded, a paranoid but not entirely unfounded concern, given Meghan and Harry's history with Netflix and other media deals. One palace source noted the irony. She's asking for privacy in the same breath she's monetized her private life. It's hard to know what's real anymore. Still, there were those in Charles's inner circle who argued for compassion. They reminded him of his own fractured relationship with his parents during his younger years, of how he had once written long, impassioned letters to Queen Elizabeth, begging for understanding after his public divorce from Diana. Could he now turn away his own daughter-in-law when she reached out in the same way? Camilla was not convinced. According to a longtime palace insider, the Queen consort was unequivocally opposed. "Don't open that door again," she reportedly told Charles. "We just barely recovered the last time she walked through it." William, too, was against it. His response, while more measured than Camilla's, was said to be steeped in frustration. He had stood by while the monarchy absorbed hit after hit, from Oprah to Spare to Netflix. And every time, it had been framed as truth, when from his point of view, it was betrayal. "She's had her platform," he told one senior aide. "Now she wants ours." But Charles, against all counsel, chose to respond personally. He penned a note in his own hand, short but formal. He agreed to meet, with one condition. It would be at Balmoral, his private retreat in Scotland, where distractions could be kept at bay and leaks would be less likely. No staff, no media, just them. When Meghan received the message, she said nothing publicly. No leaks to the press, no Instagram hints, no publicist spin. It was a rare moment of true silence. And it was perhaps the silence itself that made Buckingham Palace most uneasy. For all the criticism Meghan had faced, she was still a master of controlling the narrative. Her ability to draw attention, stir public sympathy, and spark emotional responses was unparalleled. If this silence was part of her strategy, it was working. But the story wasn't just unfolding behind palace walls. Journalists caught wind of her scheduled return to the UK, and headlines followed quickly. Meghan returning to royal grounds, alone, read one tabloid. Reunion or reckoning? Asked another. Speculation grew feverish. Royal commentators debated the motive. Supporters hailed her as brave. Critics accused her of manipulation. And yet, no one knew the truth. Days before the meeting, Meghan was seen boarding a private flight in Los Angeles. Dressed modestly, traveling without staff or security entourage. It was a calculated image, or perhaps a sincere one. No one could be certain. But what was clear was that she meant business. Whether for redemption or retribution, she was walking straight into the lion's den. Balmoral had not seen such quiet tension since Queen Elizabeth's final days. The air there felt heavy, as if the castle itself understood the weight of what was to come. Charles arrived the evening before the meeting. Meghan arrived the next morning. She was escorted not by guards or staff, but by a single royal aide, one of Charles's oldest and most trusted confidants. The symbolism was unmistakable. No pomp, no formality, just business. She was led into a private room. The door closed, and what followed in the next 46 minutes would shake the monarchy and the world watching from beyond the gates. But that chapter is still to come. This was only the letter, the paper that started it all, the plea for a second chance, the beginning of the end. And the moment King Charles chose to respond, not as a ruler, but as a father, or perhaps, finally, just as a man done being manipulated. Prince Harry had always been a man torn between identities, soldier and royal, husband and son, rebel and heir. And as the news reached him that Meghan had not only written to his father, but had received a personal response inviting her to Balmoral, alone, the pressure of his divided worlds came crashing down in a way he hadn't anticipated. When Meghan first mentioned she was considering reaching out to Charles, Harry was reportedly skeptical. He had grown weary of royal reconciliation attempts. Over the years, every effort to bridge the gap had either been ignored, mocked by the press, or worse, used against them in subtle ways. Private discussions leaked, personal assurances were twisted, and each new olive branch felt like yet another trap. But this was different. Meghan wasn't just sending a message through their representatives or public gestures. She was putting her thoughts, raw and unfiltered, into her own handwriting and directing them straight to the king. Harry, despite his reservations, didn't object. He knew how deeply the severed ties with his family affected her, more than she ever publicly let on. And perhaps, deep inside, he still held on to a shred of hope that there could be peace, that the war between the Sussexes and the firm didn't have to be forever. Yet, when Charles replied, agreeing to a private meeting with Meghan, without Harry present, that hope turned to confusion, then disbelief, then, slowly, quiet fury. According to close friends, Harry found out about the invitation not from his father, not from the palace, but from Meghan herself. She showed him the reply one late evening in Montecito, placing the cream-colored royal stationery in his hands with cautious optimism. He read it twice before setting it down without a word. For minutes, he said nothing. The air was heavy with unspoken questions. Meghan, sitting across from him on the edge of their living room sofa, watched closely. Finally, he asked, "Why now?" Meghan's response was simple. "Because I want to put an end to all this before it's too late." Too late. Those words struck Harry like a blow. Too late for what? For healing? For rejoining the family? For protecting their children from the consequences of a royal fracture they never asked for? The question swirled in his mind long after Meghan went to bed that night. He remained in the living room, the royal letter still lying on the table, illuminated by the dim glow of a reading lamp. The irony wasn't lost on him. After all the media interviews, the book, the headlines, the actual breakthrough had come from a single piece of paper, and he hadn't written it. In the days that followed, Harry reportedly grew distant. Not angry, at first, but unsettled. Those around him noticed a shift. He canceled 2 Zoom meetings related to his charitable foundation. He declined an invitation to appear on a mental health podcast he'd previously committed to. Something in him was retreating, pulling back, reassessing. And then came the bigger question. Would he go with her? To many, the idea of Meghan returning to the UK, to Balmoral, no less, without Harry was unthinkable. They had branded themselves a team from the start. Through every storm, they stood shoulder to shoulder. So when it became clear that Meghan would be meeting King Charles alone, Eyebrows were raised not just in royal circles, but across the media. Insiders claimed the decision not to accompany her wasn't mutual. Meghan had expressed a desire to go alone. She believed, or wanted to believe, that her own voice could cut through the noise. That if Charles heard her as herself, without Harry or the weight of public scandal, he might see the sincerity in her attempt to reconcile. Harry, however, took it differently. Privately, he was said to have wrestled with feelings of betrayal. Had she gone behind his back? Did she not trust him to stand beside her in this moment of reckoning? Their conversations became strained. Meghan assured him it was a gesture of healing, not secrecy. But the doubts gnawed at Harry, especially because, in all the years of conflict, he had been the one defending her, often at the cost of his own relationships. He'd lost friends, been isolated from his brother, and publicly vilified, all to protect the woman he loved. And now, in this critical turning point, he felt removed from the decision. Friends close to Harry say this moment marked a significant turning point in their relationship dynamic. For the first time, Meghan was making a major move without his guidance or involvement. And while he didn't outright object, the emotional distance was palpable. Adding fuel to the fire was the reaction from Harry's old friends and inner circle. Those who had known him before the royal exit, before California, before Archewell and Oprah. A few reached out discreetly, cautioning him about the optics. Some feared that Meghan's solo meeting would reignite old suspicions. That she was pursuing personal gain or re-entry into royal life, separate from Harry's own wishes. Others worried that Charles was using the meeting to drive a wedge deeper between them. One confidant reportedly told Harry, "This isn't a reconciliation. It's a test, and she's walking into it alone." Whether that warning had merit or not, it resonated. Still, Harry didn't stop Meghan. As much as he feared the potential consequences, he also knew what it meant to her. Meghan had never truly let go of the hurt caused by the institution, the IC protocol, the silences, the dismissal of her mental health struggles. If she could find closure, maybe she could finally move forward. Maybe they could finally move forward. But even as he supported her departure, Harry stayed behind. Alone in Montecito, surrounded by the home they had built to escape the pressure of royal life, he waited. And waiting, it turns out, can be more tormenting than action. During Meghan's flight to the UK, Harry reportedly called no one in the royal family. Not William, not Camilla, not even his father. He avoided the British media entirely and kept off social platforms. His only communication was with Meghan, sparse, brief text exchanges confirming her arrival and schedule. That silence was telling. Observers noted that for a man once so vocal about his emotional transparency, Harry had suddenly gone dark. Even his most devoted public supporters struggled to interpret his silence. Was he preparing for a new chapter, or bracing for another heartbreak? Some royal commentators speculated that Harry was finally confronting the possibility that peace between Meghan and the monarchy might not be possible, and worse, that the person most committed to trying wasn't him anymore. He had given up hope long ago. She, somehow, hadn't. And if she failed, what then? This unspoken question haunted him most. Because if Meghan returned from Balmoral rejected, humiliated, or worse, used, then Harry knew the damage would be irreversible. The final wall between them and the royal family would be more than metaphorical. It would be fortified, impenetrable. And if she succeeded, that, too, posed complications. If Meghan managed to win back favor, if she walked out of Balmoral with a path toward renewed royal inclusion, what would that mean for Harry? Could he return to? Did he even want to? Or had they each begun to move toward different futures, shaped by different wounds? The world has always viewed Harry as the one who left it all behind. But in truth, Harry never fully let go of his family. Despite all the interviews, all the headlines, he still dreamed of mending things with his father and brother. He still yearned for the childhood security that the palace once represented. And more than anything, he wanted his children to know both sides of their heritage. Not just through stories, but through experience. But Meghan's meeting with Charles reopened those long-buried hopes and fears. As she walked into Balmoral to face the king, Harry remained thousands of miles away, pacing the floors of a home that suddenly felt much too quiet. He didn't know what would be said behind those closed doors. He didn't know if Meghan would return hopeful, heartbroken, or forever changed. What he did know was this. Nothing would ever be the same again. Silence, in the royal family, is rarely just the absence of words. It's a language of its own, a calculated, time-honored tradition of restraint, power, and self-preservation. And when news began to trickle through the palace corridors that Meghan Markle had reached out directly to King Charles with a handwritten letter requesting a private audience, that language was spoken in full force. There were no press briefings, no official denials or confirmations. Not even a carefully curated palace source, quote, to muddy the waters. The firm, as insiders know it, went into a mode as old as the monarchy itself, strategic stillness. But beneath the surface, the machinery whirred. The initial reactions to Meghan's letter were split along deeply entrenched lines, reflective of personal loyalties and lingering scars. Some staffers, still stung from the public fallout of the Oprah interview and the subsequent Netflix series, were outraged that the letter had even been opened, let alone considered. Others, more measured and cautious, viewed it as a necessary, if uncomfortable, opportunity for resolution. But the most consequential responses were those of the royal family members themselves, each handling the news with their own internal code of ethics, personal biases, and unspoken grievances. Queen Camilla's reaction was swift and, according to palace insiders, brutally honest. She made no effort to disguise her contempt. "She doesn't come back here," Camilla is rumored to have said during a closed-door conversation with Charles and his senior advisors. "We've cleaned up too much already." Camilla had long been wary of Meghan, especially since the Duchess's media appearances had indirectly painted the entire royal circle as cold and unfeeling. While the Queen Consort had endured decades of public scrutiny herself, she had done so without airing grievances or engaging in televised exposés. In her view, Meghan's actions were not courageous. They were cowardly and opportunistic. And her letter? A publicity stunt wrapped in false humility. But King Charles, ever the complicated figure, both monarch and father, didn't dismiss the letter outright. Instead, he read it several times, silently, alone. Sources close to him say it reminded him of the years he'd spent writing to Queen Elizabeth, begging for compassion in the wake of his separation from Diana. He, too, had once been a pariah within his own family, misunderstood, vilified, accused of putting the crown above his children. And in Meghan's words, he recognized something familiar, the ache of someone who believed they'd been shut out unfairly. Still, he wasn't naive. Charles had seen the damage caused by Meghan's previous interviews and appearances. He understood the consequences of giving her another chance. But he also saw something his advisors had missed, an opportunity to draw a clear line, not just in private, but in principle. If this was a manipulation, he would see it with his own eyes. If it was sincere, he would know. Princess Anne's reaction was predictably stoic. She said little, as always, but her facial expression, a sharp purse of the lips and a steely gaze, conveyed her position clearly. To Anne, the monarchy was a duty, not a place for emotional theatrics or second chances. Her motto had always been, "Do the work, protect the family, never complain, never explain." Meghan, in her eyes, had done precisely the opposite. And asking for a private audience now? That felt like a tactic, not a resolution. More surprisingly, Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, were cautiously supportive of Charles's decision to hear Meghan out. The two had maintained a quieter but firm presence within the royal circle, often serving as a stabilizing force amid the chaos of the past few years. Sophie, in particular, had once tried to mentor Meghan during her early days in the family. Their relationship hadn't survived the turmoil, but Sophie reportedly told a close aide that if reconciliation was even remotely possible, Charles was right to pursue it privately. But the most critical silence of all came from Prince William. The future king had grown more guarded than ever in recent years. After Meghan and Harry's departure, and the barrage of public criticism that followed, William had hardened. Not because he lacked emotion, but because he had seen firsthand how emotion could be weaponized in the royal arena. His loyalty to the institution and to his father had become unshakable. And with every new headline, every tell-all confession from his brother and sister-in-law, William had dug his heels deeper into tradition. When informed of Meghan's letter and Charles's decision to grant her a meeting, William reportedly had just one question. "Did she ask to speak to me?" The answer, of course, was no. That fact stung more than he let on. William had endured years of public shaming and private betrayal, all while remaining silent out of loyalty. He had never told his side of the story, and now, Meghan had bypassed him completely, appealing directly to the king as if William were just a bystander in the story of the monarchy's fracture. The silence between Charles and William following that revelation lasted days. They attended royal engagements together, posed for photographs, and shared quiet nods, but the warmth was missing. The tension between father and son, so recently on the mend, had reignited. And while the palace never released an official statement, insiders began noticing subtle shifts. Meetings that typically included Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine were now being held in smaller, more segmented groups. Staff noticed increased security measures at Balmoral, not for the public, but for internal communication channels. Devices were checked. Transcripts were reviewed. It was as if the palace were preparing for an infiltration, not a reunion. Even the royal press office entered what one insider described as pre-crisis mode. They prepared reactive statements in case Meghan's visit leaked. They drafted contingency talking points, anticipating backlash. And most notably, they coordinated with the communications team at Clarence House to ensure that any leak, if it occurred, would be controlled and compartmentalized. But none came. For a family so accustomed to leaks, from both within and without, the silence surrounding Meghan's impending visit was extraordinary. No photographs, no airport sightings, no tabloid scoops, just an eerie, watchful waiting. And yet, the absence of public commentary didn't mean the royal family had come to any consensus. If anything, the division deepened. Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained entirely out of the discussion. She had taken the approach most familiar to her, grace through distance. Behind closed doors, however, she was reportedly deeply unsettled by the idea of Meghan meeting Charles without her knowledge or involvement. Catherine had been one of the quiet casualties of the Sussex departure. Her name had been dragged into interviews, her demeanor dissected by Meghan's public statements, and her silence interpreted in ways she could never correct. She had never responded, not even in whispers. But now, knowing Meghan would return to royal grounds, however briefly, stirred something long dormant in her. At a private charity event days before the meeting, Catherine's appearance drew attention not for what she said, but for what she wore, a brooch long associated with Queen Elizabeth, one the late monarch had worn during times of royal stress. Royal watchers interpreted it as a signal, subtle but intentional, a nod to continuity, a reminder of where loyalty should lie. Meanwhile, Zara Tindall watched from the periphery. Always the unofficial pulse of the younger royals, Zara's opinion mattered more than most realized. She had no titles, no formal duties, but her presence carried weight. She represented the royal family unfiltered, strong, grounded, and unimpressed by drama. To many surprise, Zara did not voice open disapproval of Meghan's approach. Instead, she was said to have remarked privately, "If she's brave enough to walk into Balmoral alone, she either means it, or she's playing a very dangerous game." That comment was passed from aide to aide, landing eventually in the king's own ear. And he agreed. Within the palace, contingency plans were made. Aides mapped out every detail of the visit, from Meghan's entry point to the room in which she and Charles would meet. It would be guarded, but not overly so. Informal, but not exposed. Every object in the room was carefully chosen, from the neutral-colored furnishings to the lack of recording devices or even decorative mirrors. They wanted nothing that could be twisted later into evidence. And yet, despite the careful planning, despite the preparation, the royal family still felt unprepared. Because this wasn't just about a meeting. It was about what it symbolized. To allow Meghan back, even for a conversation, meant acknowledging her again as part of the family. It meant risking a headline, a leak, a betrayal. But to refuse her outright? That meant cementing an estrangement that had already begun poisoning public sentiment. And so, the family did what they have always done when faced with the impossible. They waited, in silence, eyes fixed on Balmoral, ears attuned to whispers, and hearts, however protected, braced for whatever storm was coming next. The sky over Balmoral was unusually gray that morning. A thick veil of Scottish mist draped over the estate like a shroud. The air was crisp, damp with dew, and eerily silent, as if nature itself were holding its breath. It was the kind of day that seemed to absorb sound, that magnified every footstep and every whisper. And on that quiet estate, nestled deep within the Highlands, the most private and explosive confrontation in modern royal history was about to unfold. Inside the gates, activity stirred. Staff who had been briefed under strict confidentiality moved with quiet urgency. Security details, though subtle, were doubled. Windows were checked, corridors cleared. Devices were banned from certain parts of the estate. Even among long-trusted palace staff, there was a sense of hesitation, not born out of disrespect for the guest, but out of uncertainty. They didn't know what was about to happen, and that alone was unsettling. Meghan had arrived the night before. She was driven in a discreet, unmarked vehicle from a private airfield just outside Aberdeen. The press had been left in the dark. There were no paparazzi at the gates, no photographers hidden in bushes. For once, her arrival had been completely shielded from public view. A rare feat considering the media circus that normally surrounded her movements. It was as if the palace had reverted to an ancient, more secretive mode of operation. Silent, watchful, contained. She was escorted not into the main quarters, where royal guests were usually received, but into one of the private cottages located a short distance from the main residence. It was modest by royal standards, but still elegant, appointed with vintage furniture and a fireplace that burned through the night. The message was subtle, welcome, but not embraced. A guest, but not family. Inside, Meghan reportedly kept to herself. No calls, no staff interactions beyond the essentials. For someone once dubbed the Queen of Optics, it was a shockingly restrained performance. Was it humility? Strategy? Fatigue? Even those observing from afar couldn't agree. But they all agreed on one thing. Something about her demeanor was different. The morning of the meeting, she dressed simply. No designer labels, no dramatic colors. A navy blue coat, hair in a tight bun, minimal makeup. No earrings. No jewelry, not even her wedding ring, which eagle-eyed observers would later notice. Whether it was a conscious choice or a coincidence, it sent a subtle but powerful message. I am here as me, not as a duchess. The meeting had been set for exactly 10 a.m. Not 9:59, not 10:01. Royal timing was as precise as ever. At 9:55 a.m., a discreet knock came to her cottage door. A palace aide, one of King Charles's most trusted longtime staffers, greeted her with a small nod. No words, just a motion to follow. The walk to the main house was short, perhaps only 3 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Along the path, Meghan passed no one, not even the guards. The atmosphere was unnerving, as if Balmoral itself had been hollowed out for this moment. No distractions, no interruptions, no refuge. When she entered the main residence, she was not led to a grand hall or ceremonial chamber. Instead, the aide guided her to a small, quiet room tucked near the back of the estate. The same room, it's rumored, where King Charles had received the news of Queen Elizabeth's death less than 2 years prior. A place of personal gravity. The room had been prepared with the kind of precision only royalty could execute. No family portraits. No images of Queen Elizabeth. No relics of past monarchs. Just a fireplace, 2 high-backed chairs, a small side table with water, nothing more. Even the walls, painted in a muted shade of green, seemed to pull focus inward. This was not a place for spectacle. It was a place for truth. At exactly 10 a.m., King Charles entered. He was dressed formally, a dark navy suit, understated tie, no medals, no family crest. His expression was unreadable, neither warm nor cold, just calm, controlled, regal in the way only Charles could be when the stakes were this high. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Meghan stood. He nodded once, and then gestured to the chair opposite him. She sat. The air between them was heavy, not with anger. That would have been easier to navigate, but with something more ambiguous. Restraint, expectation, perhaps even fear. What was said next would remain behind closed doors. The palace, for all its dysfunction, had mastered one skill above all, secrecy. But multiple sources, briefed separately by individuals close to both Charles and Meghan, pieced together a picture of the exchange, not exact quotes, but the contours of the dialogue. Meghan began. Her voice was quiet, steady. No script, No paper. She spoke from memory, or perhaps from the heart. She thanked him for the meeting. She acknowledged the strain she and Harry had caused. She repeated that she was not there for a role, a title, or a return. She was there to make peace. For the sake of the children, she said. For the sake of the institution. Charles listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer comfort. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice that carried the weight of generations. He thanked her for coming. He acknowledged the difficulty of her life within the royal family. He even, according to one insider, said something few expected. We failed you in some ways. But what followed was not absolution. He spoke of damage, not just to the monarchy, but to individuals. He named names. He referenced Catherine, Camilla, William, even staff members who had endured abuse, threats, and trauma in the wake of Meghan and Harry's public revelations. He questioned her motives. He asked whether this meeting was part of another documentary. Meghan denied it flatly. She had not brought a phone. She was not wearing a wire. She invited him to search the room if he wished. He didn't. Still, the undercurrent was clear. Trust had been broken. And not just by the accusations, but by the method of delivery. Publicly, loudly, commercially. Then came the shift. Charles reportedly asked Meghan if she regretted any of it. The interviews, the books, the scenes played out across television screens and tabloids. She paused. Her answer, while sincere, was nuanced. She regretted the pain it had caused, she said. She regretted not having handled some things differently. But she stood by her right to speak her truth. It was that phrase, my truth, that reportedly triggered Charles's first true reaction. He leaned forward, voice still calm, but eyes sharper now. There isn't your truth in my truth, he said. There is the truth, and it belongs to all of us. From that point forward, the meeting shifted. The room no longer felt balanced. Meghan, once composed, now sat more rigidly. Charles, no longer the sympathetic father figure, began to sound more like a sovereign protecting his realm. He told her plainly, reconciliation was not possible at this time. The door to re-entry, symbolic or formal, was closed. Not locked, perhaps, but not open either. He could not offer her a role, nor support, nor even public acknowledgement. Too much damage had been done. The family had moved forward. He had made promises to others. To Camilla. To William. To the public. At that moment, sources say, Meghan's expression changed. The warmth drained from her eyes. Not anger, but realization. This meeting had not been a negotiation. It had been a farewell. Charles concluded with a line that has already become legend among those who heard of it. You may always be Harry's wife, but you are no longer one of us. The words hung in the air like a crown suspended mid-fall. Meghan stood. She nodded, thanked him again. This time, not out of formality, but finality. There were no tears, no drama, just quiet acceptance. She turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft click. And that was it. No hugs, no parting gifts, no courtiers waiting to see her off. Just one woman, walking back through the stone halls of Balmoral for what may have been the last time, her footsteps echoing through centuries of royal memory. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift. But inside the palace, something had been cemented forever. The door had barely closed before the gravity of the moment settled into the room like a weight no one dared to disturb. It was just the two of them now, King Charles III and Meghan Markle, seated across from each other for the first time in years without intermediaries, without cameras, without handlers or advisors muttering in the shadows. There were no protocols to guide this moment, no royal script to follow. Just decades of heritage meeting a woman who had, by all accounts, disrupted it all. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Charles, upright in his chair, clasped his hands lightly in his lap. His face was unreadable. Years of training had given him the composure to mask discomfort, to remain impassive even when the ground beneath him shifted. Meghan sat with her back straight, her hands folded carefully on her knee, projecting calm and intent, but not submission. Her eyes held his. She did not look away. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but low, respectful yet clear. Thank you for seeing me. Charles inclined his head slightly, but said nothing. The words hung in the air. I know it wasn't easy, she added, breaking the pause. Still, no reply. He was waiting. Meghan understood. This was her moment to speak, not his. It was not an exchange yet. It was her case to make. She took a breath and leaned in ever so slightly, her tone still controlled. I didn't come here to fix everything, she began. I know there are things I can't undo, and words that can't be taken back. But I came here because I didn't want there to be silence between us anymore. Not for my sake. Not even for Harry's. For the children. For the future. She didn't say their names, not yet. But the message was clear. She was appealing not to the monarch, but to the grandfather. To the man who had once cradled Archie in his arms, who had never met Lillibut in person, who had seen his family split by wounds he could not suture. For the first time, Charles spoke. You've caused quite a storm, Meghan. The words weren't angry. They were soft, almost weary, but they hit with the force of a hammer. Meghan's jaw tensed, just slightly, but she didn't flinch. I know, she replied, and I'm not going to pretend that I didn't play a part in that. I said things. We said things. Some of them were painful, but they were never meant to destroy. Charles's eyes narrowed just a touch, a flicker of emotion surfacing behind his measured expression. Intentions mean little when the outcome remains, he said. You may not have meant to break us, but you did. Publicly. Repeatedly. Meghan shifted, but did not retreat. Her voice remained firm. We felt we had no other choice. We tried the other way. We stayed quiet. We followed the rules. We suffered in silence for years. And it only got worse. Charles raised an eyebrow. So the solution was to expose the family to the world? To let strangers judge what they couldn't possibly understand? To profit from the pain? That word, profit, stung. Meghan paused, eyes locking with his. We didn't start out with that goal. We weren't looking for fame, or wealth, or revenge. We were looking for freedom, for peace. And when we couldn't find it here, we tried to build it elsewhere. Charles sighed, leaning back slightly in his chair. And yet, even from your new peace, you continued to throw stones. What peace requires a Netflix contract to narrate your grievances? What freedom depends on dragging this institution through the mud again and again? The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The gloves were coming off, not with shouting, but with cool, incisive truth. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was an autopsy. Meghan swallowed hard. Some of those decisions, in hindsight, were mistakes. I'll admit that. Not everything we did came from a place of clarity. But we were broken too, Charles. You may not see it that way, but we were drowning. Charles studied her. You weren't the only ones. You weren't the only ones hurting. William was hurting. Catherine was hurting. Even Camilla, whether you like her or not, was caught in the crossfire. And myself, he paused, voice dropping. I lost both my sons in one fell swoop. One to bitterness, the other to absence. Meghan's face softened for a brief moment. There was real emotion now, flickering behind the guarded exterior. I never meant for you to lose Harry, she said quietly. That wasn't my goal. But it was the result, Charles replied without hesitation. And now you come to me. Not with Harry, not with reconciliation, but alone. What? The question was pointed. It was the first time Charles had let slip the core suspicion harbored by so many within the family, that this wasn't about healing, but about positioning. Meghan had always been viewed, rightly or wrongly, as a master strategist. This solo meeting wasn't just unprecedented. It was seen by many as suspicious. Meghan didn't bristle. Instead, she leaned in. Because I needed to say this without him, she said. Because I need you to see me, not as an extension of Harry or as a headline, but as a woman, as a mother, as someone who's trying to fix something before it's too late. Charles blinked, clearly caught off guard by the tone. The sincerity, whether rehearsed or not, was convincing. Meghan continued. You may not trust me. You may think this is another performance. But I promise you, if this meeting leaks, it won't come from me. I'm not here for a second act. I'm not here to get back into the family. I'm here to end the cycle of silence. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. His gaze was fixed on her, searching, weighing. He was no fool. He had seen 1,000 performances in his lifetime, both political and personal. But he was also a father, and fathers, no matter how hardened, still carry remnants of past hopes. I will never forget what's been done, he said finally. And I cannot erase the damage. But I do recognize bravery when I see it. Coming here, it took nerve. I don't know if it took sincerity, but it certainly took nerve. Meghan nodded slowly, accepting that half-offering without argument. And what now, he asked. You've said your piece. What are you hoping I do? She exhaled. I want you to protect the children. I want them to be part of this family, even if I'm not. I want them to know where they come from. And I want this war between us to stop." Charles's eyes darkened. "And do you believe you can undo a war with one meeting?" "No," Meghan admitted. "But maybe it's a start." He stood slowly. She mirrored the gesture. The conversation, as intense and brutal as it had been, had reached its natural end. "You've spoken," he said, "and I've listened. What comes next is not up to you." Meghan dipped her head. Not a curtsy, not even quite a bow, just a nod. A quiet gesture of acknowledgement. As she turned to leave, Charles called out softly, "You are no longer a royal, Meghan, but you are the mother of my grandchildren. That matters." She turned slightly. Their eyes met one final time. "Then let's make it count," she said. And with that, she walked out. The confrontation was over. The consequences had yet to begin. What happens behind closed doors in the royal household rarely stays there for long. Balmoral Castle, despite its ancient stone walls and vast Highland privacy, is no exception. It's not the footmen or the housekeepers or even the guards who speak first. It's the silence they leave behind. The silence that screams to the courtiers and staff alike. Something happened here. And as Meghan Markle stepped out of that secluded room in Balmoral after her face-to-face confrontation with King Charles, that silence exploded into a storm of whispers. It began with subtle details. Aides who noticed the unusually stern expression on the king's face as he walked out of the room, his usually composed demeanor more rigid, his hand briefly pressed to his temple as if fending off an unseen headache. Meghan's own departure, equally restrained, drew attention too. No tears, no shaken expressions, but something in her eyes looked altered, not defeated, but perhaps finally forced to accept a reality she couldn't reshape. But while the king and Meghan said little, and officially said nothing at all, those within the royal machinery began to fill in the gaps. Multiple sources who spoke off the record claimed that during the private discussion, not only had grievances been aired, but sensitive subjects had been broached, ones that had been considered off-limits for years. And it was this unexpected descent into forbidden territory that left the palace reeling. Among the most explosive revelations was the reference to Queen Elizabeth II's final months. Insiders claimed that during the meeting, Charles brought up the anguish his mother experienced in the twilight of her reign as the Sussex drama unfolded. One source described him saying, "She didn't die in peace, Meghan. She watched her legacy unravel and her family splinter. And you had a hand in that." That alone, if true, would have been an emotional earthquake. A king invoking the memory of the queen as an indictment, not a plea. But the conversation didn't stop there. Charles is also said to have mentioned conversations that Meghan and Harry had with palace staff, ones that had long been documented in private HR reports but never publicly acknowledged. Meghan, according to one senior official who debriefed the aides after the meeting, dismissed these recollections as contextually misunderstood, claiming that certain statements she had made were either taken out of proportion or manipulated. But Charles pushed back. And then, reportedly, came the turning point, when the topic of private letters between Meghan and Queen Elizabeth surfaced. These letters, not previously known to the public, were described by insiders as deeply personal correspondences written in the early days of Meghan's royal engagement and early marriage. They were reportedly full of hope, kindness, and genuine attempts by the Queen to welcome Meghan into the fold. The palace had kept them under lock and key, but Charles referenced them during the meeting, not as a threat, but as a reminder. "She gave you her blessing," he allegedly told Meghan, "and she was repaid with betrayal." Meghan, caught off guard, defended her actions. She claimed the royal institution, despite appearances, had never truly accepted her. That behind the smiles and statements, there had always been a cold distance, a reluctance to fully embrace someone different. She didn't say the word American or biracial, but the implication lingered in the air. It was at this point that Charles reportedly grew colder. According to those briefed, he shifted the conversation to the Netflix documentary, a moment that had, to many, sealed the fate of any chance at reconciliation. Charles asked plainly whether Meghan had editorial control over how the royal family was portrayed. She denied micromanaging the production but acknowledged having a collaborative voice in the story that was told. That's when Charles, allegedly, laid down the most direct accusation of the meeting. You didn't just burn the bridge, he said. You made sure there was no timber left to rebuild it. Meghan, attempting to defuse the tension, pivoted to the children. She reminded him that whatever their adult tensions may be, Archie and Lilibet were innocent. They deserved access to their grandfather. They deserved to know their heritage. Charles didn't argue, but he didn't offer anything either. Then came the most shocking exchange of the entire meeting, a moment that would later be described by one source as the moment everything shifted from diplomacy to finality. Charles, carefully, asked whether Meghan or Harry had ever recorded any private royal conversations without consent. The room reportedly went still. Meghan, visibly startled, flatly denied it. No, she said, without hesitation. Never. But the very fact that the question had been asked was enough to rattle the walls of trust. It wasn't just paranoia. It was grounded in experience. After all, the couple had proven they were willing to reveal nearly anything, from internal arguments to formal decisions. And the line between public interest and private betrayal had blurred more than once. Charles, however, didn't press the issue further. Instead, he transitioned to one last subject: future intentions. He asked Meghan whether she intended to write another book, whether she was in talks with media companies for another docuseries, whether her return to the UK had any connection to potential content. Meghan reportedly paused for several seconds before replying. No, not unless it's something both respectful and honest. The answer didn't satisfy him. To Charles, honest had become a subjective weapon, twisted and bent into whichever narrative suited the speaker. When the meeting ended, it was under the weight of these exchanged truths and half-truths. Nothing had been resolved, but something had been revealed. Outside the walls of Balmoral, the consequences began unfolding almost immediately. By the next morning, small details began leaking. Not from the king or Meghan, but from those within the palace ecosystem who had been briefed in private circles. There was no reconciliation, one source told a royal correspondent. Only a reckoning. Within 48 hours, the palace tightened its internal communications protocols. A new directive was issued from Charles's senior advisors. No correspondence with the Sussexes was to be conducted without review from the monarch himself. This level of control was unprecedented. Even more telling, however, was the move made by the palace to quietly prepare a public acknowledgement of Zara Tindall's increasing involvement in royal duties, a pivot that many saw as symbolic. If Meghan was once the modern face of the monarchy, Zara now embodied the monarchy's answer to that modernity: understated, loyal, uncontroversial. The press, sensing a deeper story, went into a frenzy. The tabloids printed speculative headlines: Secret Balmoral Showdown. Charles confronts Meghan on hidden recordings. Royal letters revealed. Major networks picked up the scent too. Talk show hosts debated whether Meghan had crossed a final line. Pundits argued about the moral high ground. Royal historians were brought on to analyze what it meant that Charles invoked his mother's final wishes in the conversation. But no one, not the palace, not Meghan, confirmed anything. And in that vacuum of confirmation, the narrative took on a life of its own. Back in Montecito, Meghan maintained her silence. No statements, no social media posts, no interviews. It was perhaps the most disciplined media blackout she had observed since stepping into the public eye. But within the palace, the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. Conversations that had once centered around crisis management now focused on containment. No one was interested in salvaging what remained of the Sussex relationship. The question had become, how do we move on from this, finally and forever? And King Charles, in private meetings with his most trusted advisors, was said to have finally closed the chapter. There are no more discussions, he told one aide. This was the final attempt. We move forward without her. It was the moment the royal family stopped looking back. And as the tidal wave of royal secrets rippled across the world, one fact remained undeniable. Something had ended at Balmoral. Not with shouting, not with scandal, but with the quiet, shattering collapse of whatever thread still connected Meghan Markle to the House of Windsor. By the time Meghan Markle stepped back onto the gravel path leading from Balmoral's main residence to her guest cottage, the weight of the conversation she had just endured with King Charles bore heavily in every silent step. She did not cry. She did not shake. But her posture had changed. Not slouched or defeated, but restrained, like someone holding back the full weight of what they truly felt. Inside that room, she had given her appeal, endured the king's direct confrontation, and walked away with no promise, no invitation, no tangible shift in standing. Yet as she reached the door to her temporary quarters, one aide noticed something unusual. Meghan paused for a moment, looked back toward the house, and exhaled slowly, not as someone finished, but as someone calculating. The meeting might have ended, but something else was beginning. A shift in her own plan. The palace believed the door had been firmly shut, but Meghan had never been one to walk away without a contingency. Within 24 hours of the meeting, reports began to circulate quietly in the media sphere, not through the usual tabloid sources, but in the backrooms of media agencies and PR firms in New York and Los Angeles. Rumors that Meghan was exploring new storytelling platforms. Not memoirs, not royal exposés, but something else. Something more dangerous to the monarchy. A redemption narrative built around motherhood, silence, and personal evolution. Insiders close to Meghan, friends, former staff, media partners, began receiving subtle feelers. Meghan, they were told, was considering a public gesture of peace. A bold one. A kind of media truce, offering that could change the tone of the discourse between her and the royal family, if accepted. But it came with a condition. Before this idea could be acted upon, Meghan would try one more internal move, a final counterplay that she hadn't shared with Charles in the meeting room, but would float privately through trusted back channels.